Thank you, Daniel,
Thank
for
you.
the presentation first. And it's a pleasure for me to be here. As you know, I'm from Argentina, and Daniel just mentioned the expansion of BRICS. And while Argentina is one of the countries invited to join BRICS, I'm not going to talk about this in this presentation, but because this was arranged before this news, but we can talk about it in the questions if you want. My presentation is about Europe's role in Latin America in the context of competition between China and the United States, particularly in the region. I will try to follow the time as closely as I can. First, an outline of my presentation. It will be just an overview on the global competition and the impact in Latin America, then Latin America's economic context and trade trends, particularly the recent ones, and finally Europe and Latin American recent developments. In the first place, the global competition, as you all know, became well known in the last years, but a starting point of our view is that this competition between United States and China was more a result than an objective. I mean, what I mean by this is that it resulted in a competition. Neither the United States nor China were looking to compete. And this is quite evident when we see that the rise in China, which is also a product of the international liberal order in which it developed, and through the resources the main powers in the system gave to China during at least 3 decades, commercial interdependence and production dependency is one of the main characteristics, right, of this competition, given the fact that China is today the United States' main imports market and the third export destination, making reshoring and friendshoring a complex task for the United States, even though it's been said many times it was a goal for the recent administrations. Then the rebalance to Asia implemented by the Obama administration during 2010 and followed on during the next administrations was a response to a rise in China expanding through Southeast Asia particularly, but which was also responded somehow by China implemented the Belt and Road Initiative, which is turning 10 years old this year, and somehow started to shape this competitive relationship while it was still interdependent. The Belt and Road, I wanted just to highlight, is a response to, in a way, to the United States more active presence in East Asia, but it is more a result and a response to domestic-driven needs in China. And finally, in this global competition, the Global South has a particular role for China's initiatives, much more than for Europe's or the United States initiatives, we could say the Western Bloc's initiatives. That's why the emergent countries or economies are being so appealed by Chinese initiatives globally. Latin America, in this context, became also a focus for China's policies, and right now it turned to be the main economic partner for Latin America, particularly for South America, as we will see in the next slide. In terms of Latin America, something important to understand when analyzing Latin America is that the economic needs and urgencies are the main axis of Latin America's integration with the world. And development is the primary goal. Why I underline this is because probably, as we can all see on certain political conflicts, Latin America has not taken a clearly Western-oriented or liberal-oriented position. We can talk about this too later. But that's because political and diplomatic objectives are second within the rank of interests in Latin American global integration. There are still many needs regarding development and infrastructure, particularly basic infrastructure needs. And China has become not only a trade partner, but also a very competitive alternative for financing infrastructure projects. In fact, if you see the numbers, China has become the first lender for Latin America for infrastructure projects right now, even higher than the World Bank and the IMF. So China represents an inevitable alternative for Latin American countries in order to improve their economic standards. The Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank both have set foot in Latin America. They are non-exclusive initiatives led by China, so it has become very attractive for Latin American countries. As you can see in the map, most countries in Latin America are part of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, including Brazil. Mexico is a prospective member, but still not a full member. And most countries also have become members of the Belt and Road Initiative. 21 countries in Latin America are members of the Belt and Road Initiative, excluding Mexico, Brazil for now, and Colombia as the major economies that are not members of the BRI yet. This is important to take into to consider, because there are some countries like Chile, for example, which also has a very close relationship with the United States. So there we can see how even though China and the United States are competing between them, and even though the United States has a discourse of even more competition with China, in the Latin American context, we can see them somehow sharing the relationships with the countries. But what is Europe's role in this context? First, I wanted to show you some Latin American trade tendencies for the last 2 decades. You can see how the United States and China do have the most share of trade relationships, while Europe has lost some of its participation. But I wanted to show you a second figure. This one includes Mexico. It's LATAM's trade, but this one excludes Mexico. You can see the change between China's participation in South America and China's participation in Latin America. When we consider Mexico in Latin American statistics, the role of the United States becomes much more important. But when we exclude Mexico of these statistics and only include South America, you can see how China has a much more active and important role for South American economies than for the whole Latin America, in at least in trade, in the trade dimension. I think it is an important difference to consider that Latin America as a whole is hardly homogeneous. It has many differences, and one of the most important ones is the trade structure and trade partners for South America and for Mexico. We can also talk about this later. And in order to keep up with my time, as you could see, Europe has lost some part of the commercial role it had in Latin America, particularly in South America, but it hasn't lost the role it still has as one of the main investors in the region. The United States clearly is the first one with 38% of the total investment in 2023, while the European Union in 2022, I'm sorry, and while the European Union holds 17% of investments in the region. China has less than 5% of investments in Latin America. It still has a small role in this regard, but some more recent trends about Latin America and the European Union particularly, there was in July the CELAC EU meeting after 8 years in 2015, maybe showing some renewed impetus given to relations with the Latin American region. There is a changing environment in the Eurasian scenario. The war in Ukraine has a role to play in this calculation. There is also an ambivalent role of the European Union within the US and China rivalry, which is also quite close to Latin American concerns about the US and China rivalry in the region. There is also a growing concern in the European Union, which matches Latin American concerns on economic dependence on China and the need for natural resources diversification, particularly that last one for the European Union, while Latin America is a rich natural resource region. So it could become an interesting market for the European Union too, although there are some obstacles on these developments. There are certainly some differences between Latin America and the European Union regarding particularly political and diplomatic positions. The war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion has become one of the main topics on these differences. While Latin America and the EU has implemented measures against Russia's invasion and has condemned the invasion, Latin America has maintained relationships. I'm sorry, has maintained relationships and hasn't implemented or hasn't supported the measures against the economic measures against Russia. I'm sorry, I'm hearing like an echo.
5 minutes.
I'm hearing an echo.
Could you hear me now?
Yes, I think because it's open the microphone.
I was just saying 5 minutes more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And finally, the EU-Mercosur agreement signed in 2018, mostly intended to boost trade between Mercosur and the European Union, has made very small progress in the last 4 years. There are different reasons for it. Mostly for Latin America, for the Mercosur countries, particularly Brazil. Most reasons are the conditionalities imposed on exports becoming from the agricultural sector to the European Union, and environmental conditions and sustainability is one of the main concerns that the European Union is imposing somehow to Mercosur countries, in which Brazil has become the main interest, the main country to avoid this imposition. There are certain possibilities to advance, but it is clear there are opposing interests still, particularly from internal actors, both within Mercosur countries and within the European Union, within some of the European Union countries. To finalize, to end this, there are clearly shared opportunities and a shared need to enhance mutual relations in both regions. And I certainly want to underline that both shared concerns, particularly on China's US rivalry and the effects it may have on Europe and Latin America, and there are also shared values between both regions. But there are also very different interests and needs, which are, I believe, becoming the main obstacles for a closer relationship in the last years, at least. And with that, I finish. Thank you. Gracias. Obrigada.